Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're putting on our economist hats to diagnose, honestly, one of the most heartbreaking and massive geopolitical paradoxes in the modern world. We're looking closely at the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's a nation that completely defies traditional economic logic, presenting a fascinating but deeply troubling case study of how incredible potential can get completely derailed.
See, this Central African nation sits right on top of what is basically an infinite reserve of incredibly valuable natural wealth. We're talking about a literal treasure chest buried right in the earth. It's brimming with precious metals, diamonds, oil, natural gas, and all those critical rare minerals that are currently powering the smartphone in your pocket or the battery in your electric car. By all conventional logic and basic economic theory, a country with these kinds of resources should be an absolute economic powerhouse.
But here is the jarring reality that we need to unpack today. Despite this immense, undeniable natural wealth, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is actually the poorest country in the world. Their nominal GDP per person sits at just $500 a year, and an astonishing 71% of the population lives in absolute poverty. That's the highest rate anywhere on the planet.
To really grasp the magnitude of this economic failure, we've got to understand what that term actually means. Absolute poverty is officially defined as living on less than $2.12 US a day. So we aren't just talking about struggling to pay rent or bills here. This is a stark, daily reality where even the most basic human needs for survival, stuff like clean drinking water, medical attention, education, and even basic access to food are simply not met.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it frames the sheer scale of the disparity. Look at what we consider poverty in the developed world. In the United States, the poverty line for an individual is a yearly income of $11,770. And look, poverty in the US is a very real issue that should absolutely never be ignored. But it's called abject poverty in the DRC for a reason. Because making that exact same $11,000 income in the Congo, that would instantly make you an esteemed member of the top 1%. That is how deeply the economic floor has collapsed.
But, this devastating level of economic collapse wasn't always the reality there. Actually, if we flash back prior to 1960, when the Congo was a colony of Belgium, the nation was on a very different trajectory. It was making tangible, measurable progress toward becoming a true developing economy. Let's analyze the colonial economic trends of that era. In the 1950s, the Belgian Congo was literally the second most industrialized nation in all of Africa, falling just behind South Africa. Its industrial mining output was booming. Now, as impartial observers of history, we absolutely must recognize that the country suffered from many of the same severe social inequalities as South Africa did during this time. But from a strictly economic standpoint, the nation was becoming richer. There was rising investment into industry, vastly improving infrastructure, and an upward trajectory that meant the quality of life was improving. That historical fact makes its modern collapse even more of an economic mystery.
So, keeping our economist hats firmly on, we have to ask the multi-trillion-dollar question, where did this all go so wrong? I mean, they had immense resources, a solid foundation of industrialization. There was really no reason to believe the DRC couldn't have developed like so many other economies did from the 1960s onward. To diagnose this economic disease and figure out why the country fell so far behind, we need to introduce a quick framework for how economies actually function.
In social studies, we often use Maslow's hierarchy of needs to understand human motivation, right? At the very bottom, the foundation, are the most fundamental needs: food, water, and shelter. Needs that people in absolute poverty simply aren't getting met. Once those are established, you build up to safety, then social needs, and finally, at the very peak, self-actualization, which are nice to have, but arguably aren't strict needs for survival at all.
Let's move to and see how this builds when we map it directly onto an economic model. Just like people, economies have fundamental baseline needs that are easy to rank in importance. The absolute foundation, the food, water, and shelter of an economy, is stability and confidence. Without stability, you simply cannot generate the confidence required to attract investment. And without investment, you absolutely cannot achieve economic growth.
A briefcase filled with millions of dollars is pretty useless stranded on a desert island without water. I want you to think about that quote for a second because it perfectly illustrates the situation. In the exact same way, the literal piles of natural resources in the DRC are completely meaningless given that there's very little stability or confidence in the country itself. Without that baseline, the wealth sitting in the ground might as well not even exist.
And this brilliantly illustrates what a lack of confidence looks like in the real world. Think about a modern diamond mine in Canada. It's a massive industrial facility, utilizing heavy machinery, providing thousands of high-paying jobs, and generating huge output. Why? Because investors confidently poured hundreds of millions of dollars into building it. But in the modern DRC, instead of building on the booming industrial output they had back in the 1950s, a total lack of investment means workers have been reduced to using crude hand tools and the most basic machinery imaginable to just dig through the dirt. They simply cannot extract resources with anywhere near modern efficiency. It's a stark regression from their mid-century industrial peak.
The real-world cost of this instability is just staggering. No rational investor is ever going to put serious money into a DRC mine because corruption and the high threat of theft from constant civil conflict make it impossible to secure their investment. So because foreign capital is scared away, the only groups willing and able to hold these mines are operating military powers. Tragically, these groups have often stooped to using child labor to extract the resources. And the revenue from those crudely extracted diamonds, it doesn't go to building schools or infrastructure. It goes directly into funding guns and tanks, further plaguing the nation with horrendous violence.
Which brings us to a critical question for any developing nation. Can foreign aid kickstart the Congolese economy? We see massive operations from incredible aid organizations all the time, ranging from UNICEF to Doctors Without Borders to the Gates Foundation. Can their influx of resources cure this economic disease and get the DRC back on track?
Well, no, unfortunately it can't. While incredibly well-meaning and absolutely necessary for immediate survival, foreign aid functions a lot like medical life support. It will keep everything ticking along, ensuring the Congolese people get the clothing and nutrition they need to live in incredibly harsh conditions, but it fundamentally isn't meant to actually cure the underlying economic disease. In fact, injecting massive amounts of free goods into a fragile market creates a huge structural problem.
Consider this brutal economic reality. Any business that wants to sell clothes or food has to compete with a competitor charging $0. When wealthy countries donate massive amounts of free clothing and food, it is a fantastic humanitarian initiative, but economically it unintentionally suffocates local small businesses. As any politician will tell you, small business is the backbone of any economy, but competing with a zero-cost competitor in a country as poor as the DRC, it's just not possible.
So the crucial point is that this creates an impossible, devastating catch-22. On one hand, it's a tremendously tough call to pull back this aid, knowing that doing so could literally mean tens of thousands of men, women, and children will starve. But on the other hand, if you keep supplying the aid, you continually have devastating impacts on local business owners looking to ply their trade. You effectively suffocate the very economic growth needed to ever make the country self-sustaining. So what is the solution then? Well, to find the path to a true cure, we have to return to our economic hierarchy of needs. We know exactly what the solution is. Stability and confidence need to be restored to the country. Unfortunately, actually executing that is another story entirely. War and corruption have more or less become a way of life for many groups in the DRC, and as history shows us, this is an incredibly hard cycle to break.
But, hey, there is good news here, and a real reason for optimism. Just a few years ago, in July of 2019, an incredibly monumental shift occurred. All 54 countries of Africa signed on to a landmark agreement, pointing toward a fundamentally different future for the entire continent.
They launched the African Free Trade Zone. This landmark agreement means that countries across Africa will be able to trade freely amongst one another without restrictions. Heavily modeled on the European Union, the macroeconomic importance of this deal simply cannot be understated. It could be the exact catalyst needed for massive, unprecedented development all over Africa, fostering the very stability and confidence the DRC desperately needs to finally utilize its natural wealth.
To really understand the potential here, we just have to look at history. It shouldn't be forgotten that a century ago, Europe was a continent defined by centuries of brutal, continuous conflict. But the creation of the European Union, an economic integration model, brought about the longest period of peace in the region's history. See, when countries are economically linked and trading freely, war becomes terribly unprofitable. Africa now has the potential to do the exact same thing right here in the 21st century.
If that European success can be replicated here in Africa, there is every possibility that it will become the economic superpower it was destined to be. Which leaves us with this ultimate, forward-looking question. Will this free trade agreement be the catalyst that finally brings lasting peace to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, breaking the cycle of war, and lifting hundreds of millions of people out of absolute poverty? Only time will tell for sure, but the framework for a cure is officially in place.
Thanks for exploring this complex topic with me today on The Explainer, and keep asking the big questions.